the Biden administration is warming to the possibilities that it will sanction, not sanction as in economically place sanctions on, but it will allow Ukraine to use U.S. weaponry and to use allied weaponry, NATO weaponry, to target Crimea. So this, for some context, this has not been something that necessarily the Biden administration has endorsed up until this point. And what do I mean by that? It's not that the United States hasn't promoted a narrative that Crimea is not Russia, that Russia should never have annexed Crimea, that Crimea is not Ukrainian territory. It's endorsed all of those things. It said, yes, we agree with Ukraine. We're with Ukraine on this issue, but it never believed that it would be useful to strike Crimea because that would lead possibly to Russian forces and possibly U.S. weaponry coming into conflict with each other and escalate the situation and lead to more, more tensions and possibly a worsened conflict. So the United States hasn't been really open to this as much as you might have thought it would be, given that Ukraine hasn't been able to stop talking about this for months and months since the special military operation began, since Russia began its special military operation. And we've had attacks, right? You had the Crimea bridge attack. You also had the drone strikes on Sevastopol. You've had moment after moment, and the New York Times cites this. You've had moments where this has occurred, where Ukraine has maybe done what it wasn't told to do by the United States, but it has struck Crimea in the past, and now the United States is sanctioning it, meaning that it's giving a green light to possible attacks, which could lead to a higher risk of a NATO-Russia confrontation. So the New York Times says the Biden administration is considering the argument that Kiev needs the power to strike at the Ukrainian peninsula annex. That's a fancy word for saying Russia stripped it and took it away from Ukraine, when in reality there was a referendum. And in reality, historically, Crimea has been very connected to Russia, Russian people, Russian culture. But that's the propaganda narrative. So let's go through what the New York Times has to say. I think you will find it quite illuminating for a lot of the wrong reasons. So for years, the United States has insisted that Crimea is still part of Ukraine. Yet the Biden administration has held to a hard line since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, refusing to provide Kiev with the weapons it needs to target the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia has been using as a base for launching devastating strikes. Now that line is starting to soften. After months of discussions with Ukrainian officials, the Biden administration is finally starting to concede that Kiev may need the power to strike the Russian sanctuary, even if such a move increases the risk of escalation, according to several U.S. officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive debate. Crimea, between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, is home to tens of thousands of dug-in Russian troops and numerous Russian military bases. White House officials insist there is no change in position. Crimea, they say, belongs to Ukraine. We have said throughout the war that Crimea is Ukraine, and Ukraine has the right to defend themselves and their sovereign territory in their internationally recognized borders, said Adrian Watson, spokesperson for the National Security Council. Privately, military and administration officials had questioned the utility of Ukraine focusing attacks on Crimea, arguing Kiev's military had better targets elsewhere on the battlefield. What that really means is that Ukraine was already at a disadvantage, so it should focus elsewhere because it would waste even probably faster the weapons that it had received from the United States. It would waste them even faster trying to target Ukraine, which its capabilities have been continuously diminishing given just how much Ukraine's military has blown through basically everything that it has been given up until this point. But the New York Times continues that the Biden administration has come to believe that if the Ukrainian military can show Russia that its control of Crimea can be threatened, that would strengthen Kiev's position in any future negotiations. In addition, fears that the Kremlin would retaliate using a tactical nuclear weapon have dimmed, U.S. officials and experts said, though they have cautioned the risk has remained. So here we go. The New York Times is saying, and the foreign policy establishment, the blob, is saying, oh, yeah, the risk has dimmed. You remember in April, you remember when the peace talks were happening, the United States was sabotaging them, and they were saying Russia could use tactical nuclear strikes. Now they're saying, well, it's dimmed. And the only reason it's dimming is because they know Ukraine is in trouble and they have to pump Ukraine with more weapons and they have to have a pretext for that. And that is, oh, well, Crimea could be a good target now, but it doesn't have the capabilities. Ukraine doesn't have the capabilities. So let's give it the capabilities. This is what you call the calculating mind of a military industrial complex and of an empire. So the Times continues that the new thinking on Crimea, annexed illegally by Russia in 2014, shows how far the Biden administration officials have come from the start of the war, when they were more wary of even acknowledging publicly that the U.S. was providing Stinger anti-aircraft missiles for Ukrainian troops. But over the course of the conflict, the U.S. and its NATO allies has been steadily loosening the handcuffs they put on themselves, providing javelins and Stingers to advanced missile systems, Patriot air defense systems, armored fighting vehicles, and even some Western tanks to give Ukraine the capacity to strike against the Russian onslaught. Mind you, this so-called increased capability has led to a stagnant defense line, a stagnant line of defense, which hasn't moved. Ukraine hasn't made any progress in months. So obviously there is a hint of desperation here. Now the Biden administration is considering what would be one of the boldest moves yet, helping Ukraine attack the peninsula that Vladimir Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, views as an integral part of his quest to restore past Russian glory. American officials are discussing with their Ukrainian counterparts the use of American-supplied weapons, from HIMARS rocket systems to Bradley fighting vehicles, to possibly target Vladimir Putin's hard-fought control over a land bridge that functions as a critical supply route connecting Crimea to Russia via the Russian-occupied cities of Melitopol and Mariupol. However, Biden is not yet ready to give Ukraine the long-range missile systems that Kiev would need to attack installations on the peninsula. So you have to read an article like this as a part of the pressure campaign to get this done. Because as you can see, it's citing these unnamed officials, some representatives coming out of the Biden administration, but it's really the entire foreign policy establishment saying, yeah, this is the way it should go. We should be giving Ukraine the capacity to target Crimea because we want Ukraine to commit attacks on Crimea, because that would be beneficial not just to the military-industrial complex, but it would also be beneficial to escalating this conflict and putting it into the territory of permanency. That's really been the plan all along, to try to keep this thing going. So Ukrainian officials, the Times continues, have long insisted that Crimea is an important target for their attacks, and that continuing military pressure on Russian bases there is significant to their strategy. And they've also discussed with American officials the importance of increasing pressure on Russia's rear echelon in Crimea, which supports military operations elsewhere. So with the Black Sea Fleet, a major Russian airbase, command posts, and logistic hubs supporting Russian operations in southern Ukraine, the peninsula presents a major focus in Kiev's battle plans. In deciding to give Bradleys to Ukraine, the Biden administration moved closer to providing Kiev with something for which senior Ukrainian officials have been imploring the United States for months: direct American help for Ukraine to go on the offense, including targeting Crimea. When we talk to Brian Berletic tomorrow, 1:20, so for you, those of you on the playback, you know that you can find that stream tomorrow, January 20th. We're going to talk about, well, is this actually doing all that much? Because it seems like no matter what Ukraine gets, and they have received many military packages, aid packages since then, they have received weapons, this Patriot battery, but it takes so much time. There's so many considerations, and time is not on Ukraine's side. You had Condoleezza Rice, Robert Gates, right? These deep state military foreign policy establishment hawks, these neocon hawks, say it themselves on the Washington Post that this isn't going fast enough. This needs to happen now. It needed to happen yesterday. It needed to happen months ago. So the Times continues that Frederick B. Hodges, a retired lieutenant general and former top U.S. Army commander in Europe, said that in the coming months, the Bradleys could be used by Ukrainian troops to help sever the land bridge. Being able to rely on military bases in Crimea for staging was the primary reason Russian forces were able to seize land in southern Ukraine last year, a U.S. official said. Making those forces less capable is a key battlefield goal of Ukraine. Ukraine could use the Bradleys to move forces down major roads, such as the M14, which connects Kherson, Melitopol, and Mariupol, said Seth G. Jones, a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And mind you, you just need to know about the CSIS, that it is funded by major military contractors. It is funded by the U.S. State Department. It is funded by the U.S. government, the Pentagon. It is a wing of the U.S. government, and it is basically a wing of the military state. So this is who they talk to. Okay, this is who they talk to. So any Ukrainian infantry, he continues, advancing through these areas would face significant fire from Russian positions, and Bradleys offer helpful firepower for the protection of troops. The Bradleys, along with British tanks, 14 of them, that's the number, the armored combat vehicles that France and Germany have agreed to send, could be the vanguard of an armored force that Ukraine could employ in a counteroffensive this winter or spring, government independent analysts say. So Britain's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said, "We think the time is now and it's right to intensify our support. We can't allow this to drag on and become some kind of First World War attritional type stalemate." But that's exactly what's happened. And actually, it's not a World War I attritional type stalemate in the same sense that now there's a flip side to this. The forces of resistance being Russia here, yes, it is not Ukraine. That's the force of resistance. Ukraine is a proxy of the United States. It's a proxy of NATO. Russia here is resisting NATO expansion. And unlike the First World War, Russia is defending itself and it's defending Donbass using limited kinds of warfare very effectively, while the United States is in the West are trying to throw everything they can at this, and it's not doing enough. And now they're getting to a point of no return of now we need to give everything up. We need to give Ukraine everything. And that, as you will see, poses risks, and they cite that. So if Ukraine, the Times continues, does focus on reclaiming, let's say, Zaporozhye, then parliamentary attacks could include hitting targets in nearby Crimea. A major Ukrainian breakthrough in Zaporozhye would seriously challenge the viability of Russia's land bridge, the British assessment said. Ukraine also had American HIMARS long-range rocket systems. With the reclaiming last year of Kherson in the south, Ukrainian forward lines can now use them to hit main supply routes coming out of Crimea, one American military official said this week in an interview. Also this week, top U.S. and Ukrainian commanders will hold high-level planning meeting in Germany to game out the offensive planning, another U.S. official said. The drill is meant to align Ukraine's battle plans with the kind of weapons and supplies NATO allies are contributing. So they're talking about planning this next step. They're trying to plan it out. They're trying to get Ukraine back to an offensive position. Will it work? Probably not, because it means escalating this to, again, a point of no return, to a point where you will possibly have Russia assess itself. Then it needs to escalate further. It needs to now put its partial mobilization in hyperdrive and deploy everything it has mobilized thus far. And it has been mobilizing quite a lot of weapons, quite a lot. It is getting ready for some kind of confrontation, offensive or defensive. And so that's a big problem for the United States. It really is a big calculation. What will they do? We cannot necessarily predict, but we know that there are problems with this plan. The big problem is that it all takes time to get the training ready, to get the manpower ready, and it's quite likely that Russia can mobilize in defense a lot quicker than the United States and its allies can get these weapons into operational control and operational use. So Ukrainian officials fear their country cannot survive years of a stalemated conflict while Russia continues to pound cities and towns. So they see little choice but to target Crimea and put it in jeopardy, a senior U.S. official said, noting that the issue has come up in a recent high-level meeting at the White House. So they're admitting that this could be years because of Ukraine's position. That doesn't sound like victory to me. It doesn't sound like Ukraine is ready to win and ready to take anything, let alone what it has already lost, which is 20 to 30% of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, which doesn't want to be a part of Ukraine anyway, because what self-respecting people would want to be a part of a NATO protectorate that is literally backing the most reactionary forces in society? This isn't that difficult, but of course, U.S. and Western collective West propaganda has made it that difficult. So still, despite the additional weaponry, the Biden administration does not think Ukraine can take Crimea militarily, another admission. And indeed, there are still worries that such a move could drive Mr. Putin to retaliate with an escalatory response. But officials said their assessment now is that Russia needs to believe that Crimea is at risk, in part to strengthen Ukraine's position in any future negotiations. By demonstrating an ability to strike Crimea, American officials say Ukraine could show that Russian control is not established. The Biden administration also increasingly believes that hitting Russia's rear lines coming out of Crimea could severely damage Moscow's ability to push its front lines further, officials say. Without Crimea, the whole thing falls apart, says Evelyn Farkas, the top Pentagon official for Ukraine during the Obama administration. So don't you love that? The Obama administration is actually a big part of this, right? The Obama administration helped facilitate this coup. It was the leading force in the coup in Ukraine in 2014. And now it is continuing to advise the Biden administration to go harder and harder with its weaponry, with its attacks and escalations on Crimea. This is, I mean, they're saying without Crimea, the whole thing falls apart. And they're not even saying that Ukraine's going to take back Crimea. They're just saying Russia needs to feel threatened in order to strengthen Ukraine's position. I don't know what kind of military strategy that is. Military strategy, at the end of the day, is not about optics. But yet the United States wants to make it about optics. And guess why? Well, the United States wants to fuel and pump the profits. It wants to maximize the profits of the military-industrial complex. Again, Ukraine doesn't matter because this only puts Ukraine in further danger. But the Times continues that contributing to the shift in thinking is a dampening fear of targeting Crimea, driving Mr. Putin, Vladimir Putin, to use a tactical nuclear weapon, officials say. It feels to me like increasingly the administration is recognizing that the threat of Russian escalation is perhaps not what they thought it was earlier. Oh, you mean when you propagandized and you tried to scaremonger people into believing that Russia was going to drop nuclear weapons in its own territory in order to show Ukraine that it means business, when that made absolutely no sense at all? That dropping a weapon in Donbass, like where would they drop it? In Kiev? No matter where you drop a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it's going to massively impact Russia. It's going to massively impact the very forces that Russia is defending. What sense would it make? It's like if Syria, Bashar al-Assad would have used chemical weapons on his own people, would have destroyed the legitimacy of his own government. Never was going to happen. They lied to you again and again about Russia and nukes. And now they're saying, oh, the threat wasn't actually that bad. Let's just do this damn thing. Let's do it. So while Ukrainian strikes inside Russia proper still bring escalatory concerns from U.S. officials, Moscow's reaction to periodic Ukrainian special operations or covert attacks in Crimea, including against Russian air bases, command posts, and ships in the Black Sea Fleet, has been tempered. So here's the thing. They're trying to take advantage of Russia's reasonable responses to what's happened. There's already been terrorist attacks in Crimea. There's been strikes on Sevastopol. This is an admission that, oh, well, Russia, the RAND Corporation, another U.S. government think tank, or basically the research arm of the Pentagon, saying, oh, yeah, Russia tolerates these attacks. We can just strike Crimea. Nothing will happen. That's what they're trying to tell you in order to manufacture consent for war. Still, Vladimir Putin, the Russian public view, says the Times, view Crimea as part of Russia, so strikes could solidify Russian support for the war, obviously. For their part, U.S. officials say they don't know how Vladimir Putin will react if Ukraine attacks Crimea using American-supplied weapons. Mr. Massicot said that none of Ukraine's handful of attacks on Crimea so far have threatened Russia's ability to maintain its claims on the peninsula, so they may not be an accurate test of Russia's resolve at this point. So last month, you had Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, reiterate standing American policy on Ukraine that the Biden administration was seeking to help the country take back territory seized during and after the invasion last year. And so it's trying to reiterate that, yeah, we're not trying to go back to 2014. We're trying to focus on what it needs right now to push back against Russian aggression since February 24th. A very legalistic position, right? Basically admitting that, yeah, no, we're not trying to basically wage a proxy war crusade to restore the borders of 2014, pre 2014. Actually, the truth is that they're doing something much more sinister. Of course, they want regime change in Russia. They want destabilization of the region. They want Ukraine to be a NATO country. That's the ultimate objective. It's much worse than what they're saying they're not for. But at the same time, publicly, Antony Blinken has to say this, because the reality is that their agenda is not necessarily one that can find success at this moment. But the Time says that position, critics say, has largely given the Russian military an untouchable sanctuary from which to attack Ukraine. We have, in essence, here we go. This is, I love this person's name, Philip Breedlove, a retired 4-star Air Force general who was NATO's supreme allied commander for Europe when Russia invaded Crimea. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. You gotta love the propaganda. Russia did not invade Crimea. Crimea literally asked for help. There was a coup regime happening. There was a proxy war already underway. There were coup forces, many of them far right, neo, and just ordinary NAZIs, committing absolute atrocities in Donbass. And the people of Crimea said, absolutely not. We're not going to be party to this. And they asked Russia for help. And Russia came in and they had a referendum. And that was that. But of course, here, Philip Breedlove says, well, we have in essence put limits on Ukraine, saying this war is going to be fought on your soil, not on Russian soil. To give Russia a sanctuary from which to fight without fear or reproach is absolutely absurd. It makes no military sense. That's the last thing the New York Times wants to tell you. So what do you think that means? That they have this retired 4-star Air Force general who is NATO supreme commander under Obama, Philip Breedlove, obviously a hawk, literally telling you that it is ridiculous for the United States to allow Crimea to be used by Russia in this way. So what they're saying is that the U.S. should target Crimea through Ukraine. Ukraine should start to do this as soon as possible. And that, my friends, my comrades, my colleagues, everyone listening to this, all the viewers here, you wonderful viewers, you are essentially hearing the United States say through its mouthpieces, right? And look at all of them. Helen Cooper, Pentagon correspondent. Eric Schmidt, a former Pentagon correspondent. Julian E. Barnes, national security reporter based in intelligence agencies. You basically have the New York Times acting as a conduit for the Pentagon and the intelligence apparatus. What they are saying to you is that now there are serious considerations that whatever weapons package is finally announced by the U.S. and its NATO countries, probably sometime after tomorrow, not too long. Maybe it'll happen tomorrow. Maybe their talks have gone more successfully than we think they are. It seems that there seems to be a lot of division here, but nonetheless, whatever happens there, the strategy here, what they're saying is that they need to do a couple of things. They need to make sure that the optics are in place. So that means militarize Ukraine, fortify with whatever you can, pressure Germany to give tanks. Probably not going to happen. Get all the collective ones to give everything they can first, because the United States doesn't want to dip into its own stockpiles. And you'll see why with a recent story that also happened this week, that also was released this week. The United States doesn't want to do that. The United States does not want to dip into its own stockpiles. So what it's saying is it's going to try to get everything to Ukraine from NATO members that is acceptable to them, and hopefully they'll just comply. Not so sure that it's going to be 100% compliance, but nonetheless, fortify. Give them more HIMARS. Give them tanks are the big thing. Tanks. They want tanks. We'll see if they get them. But the point here is that the strategy is Crimea. The strategy is let's get even closer. You already have Ukraine at times striking Russian territory, mostly in the Donbass, but even close to Russia's borders proper, right? You do have that activity happening. Now they want to go for what really is a deeper red line, Crimea. And that may say to Russia, well, this threat of a global confrontation with the United States and NATO is not just worse than we thought. It's actually here right now in this particular conflict, in this particular stage of the conflict. Well, we have to engage. And that could precipitate further escalations. That's why I say the US is preparing for World War III, because these are the conditions that you build, that you create in order to do that at some point in the future. I'm not saying it's happening tomorrow, not saying it's happening the next day, but when you have the United States green light Ukrainian attacks using US and NATO weaponry to do so, that sends a signal that this conflict is not just one that they want to be permanent, but one that they want, that the US and the foreign policy establishment want to turn, you know, even further into a full frontal, a full scale confrontation with Russia, which is the definition of what World War III, or really a great power conflict, or a sort of new global conflagration, that's what it will look like. That's what it would look like. It would look like the United States and NATO engaging Russian forces directly, and moving it into build up to that, you do so indirectly. And that's what the Ukraine proxy war has been all about from the beginning. And now we're seeing 2023 start to develop the rudiments of this. However, one thing that's important to note is that the United States is not a lion, right? It's not a king. It's not a kingmaker. It is no longer in a position to just get what it wants whenever it wants. NATO either, right? As an extension of US imperial power. Neither of them are. Now you are seeing the limits already come into place where you have, or come into play where you have this narrative. You have the optics. They want to show the, but even in this New York Times article, they say they can't do it. Ukraine will never be able to do it militarily. But Russia needs to believe they can. And that's how suicidal the US's endless war regime is, because it's not about necessarily winning or losing. It's just about the neocon strategy, as well as what will make the money, what will have to pay dividends to the US empire in the future. And they believe building up to a global confrontation, a world war with Russia, by escalating this Ukraine conflict to Crimea, by making this what it always was, an extension of the 2014 coup of this proxy war, well, the United States is saying, okay, conditions aren't good right now. We got to do everything we can to ensure that the tide turns. Well, guess what? The tide is not turning. What the U.S. is actually doing is causing the world to burn. So the tide isn't turning, but the world is indeed burning because of this.